Hi everyone, it's Andrew with the Alliance for Innovation Infrastructure, and this month is Energy Month, which means we've been sitting down with industry professionals about the energy resource relevant to their line of work. However, today we're speaking with AII Executive Director Benjamin Durker to touch on the importance of petroleum and how this energy resource exists in our nation's energy mix. Hi Ben, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. It is such a pleasure, and Energy Month has been such a success. This month, I've actually learned a ton about different aspects of energy that I didn't even know. And it's just really fruitful to hear from experts in their field and to hear how those things intersect in different energy, different infrastructure, different policy approaches. There's just been so much to learn on our end, and I hope it's been really great for our audience as well.
It was definitely very rewarding to talk with people all across the country. That was one of the greatest things about Energy Month this year. To begin, I want you to expand on the position you hold at AII. How do you serve our think tank?
That's a great question. So my role is executive director. I'm basically in charge of ensuring that our goals as an organization move forward. That includes setting new goals, different areas of policy to research, making sure that we are doing high quality research on the areas that we already have. Some of that is energy related, for instance, Energy Month. Some of it is just kind of what people would consider as boring infrastructure. But we really try to take an innovative approach to that and look for what is happening out in the field, different best practices, different innovative things being piloted, cutting edge approaches. We try to study those and educate both the general public and people in positions of leadership, whether that's in industry or in policy-making circles. Really what we're trying to do at AII is make sure that conversations are happening. We can bridge the gap between regulated parties and regulators, make sure they have shared vocabulary, they're working toward the same goals. We really see ourselves facilitating that conversation and also just helping to promote best practices, provide education, really identify what the challenges are in the world and propose solutions to them.
Excellent. How do you think the approach that we took with this Energy Month campaign has affected our think tank in general?
I think it's really been fantastic. I think probably the best thing is a lot of people who have never heard about AII are getting to hear about us. We're the nation's only public policy think tank that's dedicated solely to infrastructure. So there's a ton of really great organizations out there that do a lot of similar work, but they're either trade organizations that represent their own industry, or maybe it's academic, it's university professors or scholars who are studying certain fields. And then there's other think tanks that maybe have a department or scholars who handle these things or research them. We're the only nonpartisan, nonprofit, public policy think tank that our whole portfolio is infrastructure topics. So we're looking at energy infrastructure in the grid, we're looking at transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, pipelines. We're looking at the policy, the public policy that frames those things, from government agencies to different industry actions. So we're really in a space that is helping support the industry, improve and educate what policymakers are doing, helping them both be on the same page. And I think a lot of people didn't know about us before, now have heard about us. And I think that's just really going to help our mission going forward, because we can only do what we do well when we have a good network of industry professionals who can tell us the insights they're seeing in the field, the things they're trying, the struggles they're having, the problems they're confronting. And on the other side, the policy circle and network to know things they're trying to regulate, maybe regulations they're trying to repeal. Do they need more information, more data points before they pursue a line of regulation? We just want to be in that space. And so I think it's been really cool to be in Energy Month this year, seeing all these different parties not only being interviewed. I think you've done a fantastic job, but I've gotten feedback too from people who said they've learned from this, and maybe a regulator who's seen something and said, wow, this industry, I didn't realize they did this. And so now we get to facilitate conversation, connect them, or provide educational research resources for them.
Yeah, I definitely think it's so important that we pursue conversations with the people who are working in these fields full time. My last question regarding this is, why do you think it's so important to establish a connection with the public and educate them on infrastructure issues in our nation?
Infrastructure is the most important thing that people don't think about. So everyone, and I know, Brigham said this, you've said this, and every expert knows this, but we just wake up in the morning, we turn on our faucet, we flip on a light switch. There are things that are happening in our lives that we take for granted. Some people are completely blind to, but that is physical infrastructure. You wouldn't have water coming into your house. You wouldn't have waste going out of the house. You wouldn't have your lights turning on. You wouldn't have internet access. All these things are very basic to us in this day and age, and we take it for granted, but it is supported by and made possible by this vast network of complicated interconnections of physical infrastructure. And somebody might still say, okay, well, I didn't think about it, and now I know. Okay, great, I rely on infrastructure. But that person is going to vote in a local election, a state election, a federal election. They are going to be making economic decisions that are contingent on certain infrastructure things. And so for them to just be more informed generally as they go about not just voting, I mean, that's one part of our civic life, but the economic activities that they do, the route they take to school or to work or things like that. It's just more important that they know about these things. The more they're informed about it, the better we can ultimately shape these things, because they're making more efficient decisions. They're voting for people who are going to raise these issues, and they can avoid negative externalities from some of these things, and not just traffic and congestion, but different things that may come from using a type of energy resource, or maybe they're foregoing a benefit that they could be getting from something. We want them to know, and so the more we can facilitate conversations like this, interact with the public, and also learn what they think is important to them. If we start hearing everyone's talking about one thing, we can study that and report it back to them so that we're really filling a need for them as well.
I think it's also really important to highlight that the Alliance for Innovation Infrastructure also includes the word innovation. And going off of what you said, that we have these things in front of us that are so complex, and the way that innovation has changed and grown over time, just ultimately heightened because of demand. There are a lot of blind spots I feel people have with the ways that innovation have transformed how we approach daily things like conversation, right? Someone can have a phone in their hand and not know how the phone works. So my question to you is, how do you think we can encourage people to think about innovation while also understanding the repercussions of innovation?
Innovation is more than just thinking about technology. It's really just a new way or a more clever way to do something. So, we at AII, we think about innovation in all those different modes. It's not just, can we use drones to do inspections faster than a person walking along the road? Yes, that is innovation. That's cool. That's a great way to do it. It can improve safety outcomes. It can improve efficiency. But we also think about innovation in public policy, new ways to structure laws and regulation, new funding mechanisms to support, for instance, the Highway Trust Fund, new ways to structure policy and regulation. Innovation in that mode is also helpful because it can spare resources, make things more efficient. So we just want to be thinking about all those different avenues for it. When it does come to our daily lives, the ways we interact with our phones and things like that, there's also a really important thing that we can't as a society lose our understanding of how certain things work. So it's okay for the average person not to know how a phone or a camera works. It's not really dependent. We have specialization where there are people who know how to do that. But we want to keep this baseline IQ where people understand how things generally work, how our policies work, how our system of government is structured, how our roads interact with people, how our supply chain is dependent on physical infrastructure, the physical infrastructure components that underlie our virtual realities like cell towers, fiber optic, broadband, cables, server farms that actually support the internet. We want people to understand at least that those things exist and what their importance is, so that as innovation is happening in the industry, in the lab, in the field, they can understand that it's important to support those things, whether it's research and development or voting.
So let's dive straight into the energy resource that we're going to be talking about today. How would you define petroleum, and what are the challenges unique to this resource?
Petroleum is a pretty broad spectrum of energy resources. What we're talking about here is oil that comes out of the ground, but also refined products like gasoline, diesel, distillates, things like jet fuel. A lot of these, I'm going to put them all under the umbrella of petroleum. So on the one hand, it's crude oil that comes out of the ground. That's a geologic reserve resource. It comes out of years of compacted organic material being formed underground. That is a liquid that we can extract. We pump it alongside natural gas. When we do that, it goes through a network of physical infrastructure like gathering lines, transmission lines, and distribution lines to different facilities to be processed in one way or another. And then we typically interact with petroleum as gasoline. I think the average person, they fill up their tank, they see gasoline, and they think, all right, that's my petroleum product. And so one of the challenges is having people understand how critical petroleum actually is to their daily life. There's a movement out there to kind of leave it in the ground or just, avoid fossil fuels altogether. Hydrocarbons is another word for fossil fuels. The problem there is we don't just use petroleum for gasoline. So if you do think of it that way, it's narrow and it's limiting to how broad and applicable it actually is to your daily life. Petroleum is used for a wide range of things like plastics. It's used for feedstocks to produce other things. So the people who say leave it in the ground may be only thinking about transportation. Sure, as a transportation fuel, maybe one day we can get to all electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, fuel cells, different things like that. But we really can't leave petroleum in the ground currently in our economy. It just wouldn't work, not in the United States and certainly not globally. It's just too critical of a resource, separate from energy altogether. It's an energy resource, but it's also just a physical material resource that we use for almost everything that we do.
What do you believe the public should know?
Yeah, I think the public should know that petroleum is more than just gasoline. It is a transportation fuel, but it also supports and is needed to produce things like plastics and also things like grease and paint and things that are needed for electric vehicles, to be totally honest. It's not just a transportation fuel. Petroleum in all of its different arrays is needed for those things. And it's also needed for flight. I mean, you couldn't fly to climate summits without petroleum. So there's sort of an irony in the way that we approach discussions about it. Primarily, I would just tell people petroleum is not an enemy resource. If you don't like it for energy because it's polluting when it's combusted, then you should embrace it being used for other things like supporting a green economy. We really can't have renewables without petroleum. We can't have electric vehicles without petroleum. It's needed at a basic element just to mine all of the raw materials for wind farms, solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, because we need heavy machinery to actually do the mining. We need it to move on our supply chain across the oceans, across our trains and trucks. And then it's used in everything from adhesives to grease, and a lot of the things that go into the ultimate product anyway. So, think of it more as a resource, not an energy resource.
How do you think public perception has shifted over the last 10 years?
Over the last 10 years, I would say petroleum has gone out of style. I think a lot of people, again, they view it in a limited way, that it's just an energy resource, and it's really not. It's a vital energy resource in its own right, and a transportation resource, and necessary for these other things that support the economy. I think a lot of the national discussion is led by things like headlines and pundits and commentators who don't have experience in the industry, certainly don't have experience, even just reading studies about where these resources are needed and used elsewhere. And so I think we're just sort of being led in a conversational way by people who ignore or don't understand some of the underlying realities. And I'm not saying oil has to stay forever as an energy resource. There's certainly arguments against that. But it is needed now, and the people who are kind of saying we don't need it or don't want it are ignoring the negative externalities that will come from that. Obviously, you're going to have people who lose their jobs on the oil fields, a lot of blue-collar jobs, a lot of pipeline jobs. Those people will lose their job if you penalize oil production. But you're also going to increase the cost of a ton of other things, including renewables, if you just start shuttering oil and gas wells and stop giving leases out. So there's a lot of problems that people haven't thought through. And this is one of the reasons AII looks at these issues, because it's not just an energy resource issue. It's a public policy framework across all these different areas. If you stop producing oil and gas, you have rippling effects through public policy, through transportation, through inflation, through costs that are going to affect billions of people, because this is a worldwide market in really just ways that are foreseeable if you think about them. But people just don't often know all those intersections, or they choose a particular narrative or lens that they want to view this. And that lens may be totally appropriate, but it's one lens out of many and doesn't capture everything. I mean, if climate is the one focus that you want to have, that's great. Let's start there. But you can't ignore that, we won't have plastics if we stop producing oil altogether. It's just something we need to face trade-offs in reality as we make informed decisions about those other things.
Would you like to briefly touch on the gas tax?
So the gas tax, this is an excise tax used for funding our roads. You may or may not know, when you fill up at the gas tank, if it's gasoline, 18.4 cents of every gallon is actually a federal tax. So if you roll up and you have a $2.18 gasoline per gallon, the gasoline that you're actually paying for is really $2. And the 18 cents you're seeing in that is going to go to the federal government. We haven't seen $2.18 gas in a long time. So maybe that's more like $3.18 or $4.18 in some places. But that's collected by the Highway Trust Fund, which is responsible for funding the highway network across the United States, really for maintenance and repair. We have had issues with solvency in the last 10 years because there have been two accounts to that Highway Trust Fund. There's the highway account that sends money back out to fix roads, and there's the mass transit account, which tends to take more resources than it puts in. It's for things like local city transit projects. There's also an issue where we haven't raised the gas tax in a long time. So that 18.4 cents per gallon is the same as it was 20 years ago. And obviously, I think everyone watching this video knows we've had massive inflation since then. Just in the last 2 years, we've had big inflation, but huge inflation to where the dollar is actually weaker. So that 18 cents that was collected 20 years ago was more powerful. It could build more roads than the 18 cents collected now. And separately, we've had crazy innovation in the automotive industry, where now we have electric vehicles and hybrids, and even just the regular fleet of gasoline internal combustion engine vehicles. Those cars go way further on a single gallon than they did 20 years ago. So then you were collecting 18 cents a gallon and your purchasing power was stronger and people were driving fewer, so they needed to fill up more often. Now people can drive further on the same gallon. That dollar is weaker. So we just can't fund as much. And so without fixing these policy issues, we can't fix and solve our road issues. So if you've seen potholes, if you've seen issues that are not being repaired, it might be because we haven't fixed the gas tax.
What would you like policymakers and decision makers to know?
There's a lot. I think people view petroleum in too limited of a way. So I would start by saying we have to have policymakers understand all of the places that are touched by petroleum, not just the energy markets, but the supply chains generally, the need for that in renewable energy collection, for electric vehicle production, for mining. Fossil fuels are a critical resource to do those things. But also there's areas that are not energy specific, but that gasoline touches, like the gas tax. There needs to be something that addresses the gas tax, whether it means tying it to inflation or allowing registration fees for electric vehicles or something like that. And I'm not proposing these things, but a vehicle miles travel tax, something that would fix the gas tax to where we can adequately fund our roads without using a proxy for road use that gasoline actually is. It's not actual road use, it's a proxy for it. So policymakers across all these different areas need to really think about the externalities that are created by public policy. And some of that may be removing policy or regulation that is having a harmful effect, and some may be writing new things. But I would just encourage policymakers at the local, state, and federal level to view petroleum as a resource, not just an energy resource, and to think about how it intersects with not just transportation, but manufacturing, healthcare, agriculture, where it's used as a feedstock for things and also where it's used as an energy resource, and not to discourage it without having at least something to replace it, not offering incentives for one thing and penalizing another. Let the markets work where they can.
I think the biggest thing to think about really is, what does petroleum offer that others can't benefit us in the same way?
It goes to what it is you want petroleum to do for you. We've focused a lot on Energy Month on electricity generation. So when we're talking about electricity, petroleum is responsible for less than 1% of the electricity in the United States. So it's kind of forgotten in that way. Some places, I think Hawaii uses it more substantially for its electricity generation. But as an energy resource, it really can't be beat right now for transportation. People will say we live in a petroleum world, an oil and gas world. That's because our transportation fleet was built on the idea of internal combustion engines. And nothing else provides that level of power for the amount of resource. So that's the energy density that petroleum, or in this case gasoline and diesel, that it contains. and also that it's storable. You can just keep it in a tank, whether that's your gas tank or in a tank under a gas station or a large reservoir. You can hold it for long periods of time, and that you can contrast that pretty easily with battery power. Electricity you can store in a battery, but you can't store it for 50 years and it'll deplete over time. Gasoline, it also can't stay for 50 years without losing some of its chemical components. But oil and gas, so in this case gasoline, really is just an unrivaled transportation fuel. It lets you drive very far and have a lot of power to do what you need. And I think in a lot of places, that's actually really essential, like mining. Yes, you can build electric engines and electric trucks and tractors and things that will do some of these things, but they don't necessarily have that raw power that gasoline and diesel and those types of combustibles can provide. So on a long time horizon, I would love to see, a transition to electric fleets and things like that, but we're just not there yet. We're not even really at the transition zone yet. We just need to build out the technology that will allow that transition. And for right now, oil and gas does it very well.
What are your final thoughts?
On petroleum, my final thoughts are it's a really useful resource. And I would just encourage people to think of it more than an energy resource. And I think one of the things that happens with petroleum that doesn't happen with the others is people see it through the lens of its negatives. There are negatives to petroleum. It's gross, it creates emissions when you burn it. And I think people nowadays have thought about this through the lens of climate change, and they think, okay, this creates greenhouse gases and other emissions that are bad for public health, so this resource is bad. But that's not how we view anything in the world. We view everything through costs and benefits. What's its net impact? And so, like I've said repeatedly, oil does have negatives, but it also has tons of positives. Not to mention that it facilitates the ambulance that drives you to the hospital if you need it. Plastics and things that package your food, syringes. There's so many things that it does that we don't even think about. It's more life-sustaining and giving than it is negative, even though there are very real, legitimate negatives to it. But we don't view other things that way. We don't see wind and solar and say, oh, sure, it produces power, but have you seen that it can't be recycled and how it leads to toxic waste when it's thrown in a landfill? We don't think of things that way. For some reason, oil has gotten that bad rap. And I'm not saying we should view the others that way. I'm not saying, oh, you see a solar farm, you should think about chemical leaching into the soil. Sure, you should. I mean, you should think of things holistically. I think it's very odd that we've put petroleum into this negative lens and only viewed it that way and totally ignored its positives and its benefits. I would just encourage people to have a net view of things where you factor in the positives and the negatives and let things stand on their own merits. If there's literature out there and people can point to legitimate overall negative impact of petroleum, okay, how do we move markets towards something different? But nobody's done the work to show that. They've just said, all right, we have these climate negatives and that's bad enough. It's just not a good way to live in reality or public policy. It's going to lead to higher costs, higher deaths even. And that's not something we want. We want people to flourish and thrive. We want safe, resilient infrastructure and transportation networks and energy access. And a lot of that right now, if it's not facilitated by directly, it's somehow supported by hydrocarbons. Ordinarily, I think Andrew closes these videos, but since I'm here, I would love to take over the role. Andrew, thank you so much for just running an incredible energy month. You put on a lot of incredible, insightful material. And I think it's just been really cool for people to see. If anyone has any questions or want to learn more after this, I would direct you to aii.org/energy month and tune in to aii.org for more content throughout the year.
Thank you, Ben. And if you guys also have something that you want us to cover, make sure you mention it in comments.